On June 6, 1853, a $54,000 clipper ship, sleek, swift, the pride of 19th century shipbuilding, cut through the Pacific night, bound for San Francisco after a long voyage around Cape Horn. Her narrow hull and full sails spoke of a successful passage. But as she neared the central California coast, a heavy fog suddenly swallowed the horizon. Then it came, the sound of splintering timber in the darkness. The Carrier Pigeon had run aground just 500 feet from shore. Waves lifted her and hurled her against hidden rocks. No light, no warning, no lighthouse. That night, a nameless stretch of coastline was forever marked by tragedy. But what exactly happened? What? In the fall of 1852 at the shipyards of Bath, Maine, a new clipper slid into the water. Sleek, narrow, and built for speed. She measured 175 feet in length, carried a slender 34-foot beam, and was rated at approximately 845 tons burden. She was valued at $54,000. A considerable sum for her time, and together with her cargo, she was insured for nearly $195,000. Her name was Carrier Pigeon, and she represented the very best of mid-19th century American shipbuilding. Iron-fastened timbers, sharp lines, towering masts, and the promise of profit carried on the wind. On January 28, 1853, she departed Boston on her maiden voyage, bound for San Francisco under the command of Captain Azariah Doane. The gold rush had transformed California into a magnet for trade, and clipper ships like the Carrier Pigeon were the lifelines of commerce, racing around Cape Horn to connect the Atlantic world to the Pacific frontier. Her voyage southward was swift. She rounded Cape Horn successfully, a feat that alone tested the courage of any captain and crew. The Southern Ocean showed her no mercy, yet she endured. By early June, she was sailing north along the California coast, her mast still standing proud, her hull intact, her future seemingly secure. On the morning of June 6, 1853, the Carrier Pigeon was sighted off Santa Cruz. She was making excellent time. Nothing suggested catastrophe. But as she continued northward towards San Francisco, conditions changed. A heavy coastal fog began to thicken. The horizon disappeared. Landmarks vanished. In an era before radar, before electronic navigation, a captain's judgment was everything. By nightfall, Captain Doane believed he had steered the ship far enough offshore to be safe. Confident he was clear of danger, he altered course eastward, intending to sight land and confirm his position. It was a decision made in good faith, grounded in experience. But the fog concealed more than distance. It concealed stone. Without warning came the sound, splintering timbers tearing through the dark. The Carrier Pigeon had run hard aground on submerged rocks, just 500 feet from shore along the central California coast. 500 feet. Close enough to see land at dawn, too far to prevent disaster in the night. The Pacific swells wasted no time. Waves lifted the 845-ton clipper and slammed her repeatedly against the rocks. Each blow widened the breach in her hull. Water rushed in. Her structure, built for speed rather than impact, could not withstand the relentless pounding. Remarkably, Captain Doane and his crew were able to make it ashore safely. There was no great loss of life that night, but the ship herself was mortally wounded. The following morning, word of the disaster was sent to San Francisco. Requests for assistance were dispatched. The U.S. Coast Survey steamer Active arrived to render aid. She was soon joined by the sidewheel steamer Seabird. Even rescue proved hazardous. Seabird encountered her own peril and had to be beached near Point Año Nuevo to prevent her from sinking. Salvage operations continued, but little of the cargo could be recovered. The sea had claimed its prize. In the end, the once proud clipper, valued at $54,000, was sold where she lay for only $1,500. And so on June 6, 1853, a nameless stretch of rugged California coastline gained an identity. Mariners began referring to the site of the wreck by the name of the fallen ship, Pigeon Point. By the 1860s, the Pacific was no longer a distant frontier. It was an economic highway. California's cities were growing. Industry was rising. Steam power demanded fuel, and that fuel was coal. Australia, perched atop vast deposits of lignite and bituminous coal, had already become one of the world's major producers. Two ports in particular, Sydney and Newcastle, stood at the center of that trade. Coal mined along their shores was loaded into the holds of sailing vessels and sent across the Pacific to supply California's expanding markets. In an age before the Panama Canal, ships sailing from the American East Coast had to round the entire length of South America to reach California. Australian vessels, by contrast, had a more direct Pacific route. As a result, barks like Coya and Hellespont became colliers, workhorse sailing ships carrying thousands of tons of coal toward San Francisco. Coal was a free-flowing bulk cargo. It was poured directly into a vessel's hold. Earlier in the century, it had been shoveled aboard by hand, but by the 1860s, steam cranes were improving efficiency. Yet no mechanical advancement could alter the reality of ocean navigation. When fog swallowed the horizon, when storms obscured the sun and stars, captains were forced to rely on dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed, time, and estimated course. It was a method dependent on judgment, experience, and luck. And along the steel-gray California coast, luck was often in short supply. The shoreline south of the Golden Gate was particularly deceptive. Strong winds drove vessels toward land. Currents set ships off their expected track. Heavy mist rolled in without warning. A captain could believe he was safely offshore, only to find stone beneath his hull. The Coya was built in 1863 in London. She was an iron bark of 515 tons, measuring 156 feet in length. Her iron hull plates were less than an inch thick, durable, economical, and resistant to fire, but no match for the Pacific's submerged rock. In 1866, she sailed from Australia bound for San Francisco carrying coal. On board were 29 souls, crew and passengers, including 6 women, among them the wife and young daughter of Captain H. Page. For days the ship labored northward through heavy seas. Steel-gray skies hung low over the water. Thick mist reduced visibility. Unable to take reliable celestial sightings, the captain relied on dead reckoning to estimate his position. It was a calculation that would prove fatally wrong. On November 24, 1866, the Coya struck the rocks at Pigeon Point. The impact was violent. Waves lifted the vessel and hurled her back down against the reef again and again. One contemporary report noted that she almost immediately began to break up. Panic erupted on board. Many of the passengers had been below deck enjoying tea. They were thrust without warning into chaos. George Burns, one of the few who survived, later recalled the horror. The sea kept lifting her from rock to rock, crushing in the bottom, he said. With the sea breaking over us, nothing could be seen but a mass of hissing foam. Another memory was even more haunting. The ladies were screaming and being washed away one by one. Captain Page fought desperately to save his family and those under his care. A doctor, Roden tied his life vest to his wife before she was swept away. Mrs. Jeffries wrapped her baby in a woolen shawl in a final attempt at protection. Prayers were offered in the darkness. It was all to no avail. 26 of the 29 people aboard perished. Only 3 survived: George Burns, first mate Thomas Barstow, and seaman Walter Cooper. Cooper later described reaching shore by clinging to a piece of timber with death's grip. The battered survivors spent the night partially buried in a hole in the sand, trying to shield themselves from cold wind and surf. When daylight came, the devastation was complete. The Coya's hull had vanished. Wreckage littered the beach. Among the debris lay the body of Mrs. Jeffries, her empty, torn shawl beside her. The coroner's investigation delivered a clear conclusion. The coast near the point was very dangerous on account of its peculiar location, climate, and currents. The jurors wrote that it was the duty of the proper authorities to put a light on the point. For the first time, the demand for a lighthouse at Pigeon Point was formalized in official language. But 2 years passed. Trade continued. Ships still set sail. Yet no lighthouse was built despite every effort. The Hellespont was a wooden bark of 750 tons, built in 1856 in Bath, Maine, by E. and A. Sewall. She measured 160 feet in length with a 32-foot beam. Her owners, N.L. and G. Griswold of New York, were prominent merchants, so confident in their enterprise that their initials were said to stand for no loss and great gain. In November 1868, the Hellespont departed Newcastle, New South Wales, carrying 1,100 tons of coal. On board were 18 crew members under the command of Captain Cornelius Soule, a man regarded as skilled and trustworthy. For days, the vessel battled fierce seas and inclement weather. Heavy mist obscured visibility. Again, reliable sights could not be taken. Again, navigation depended on estimation. On November 18th, 1868, the Hellespont ran directly into the breakers at Pigeon Point. Helmsman Frederick Wilson later testified, "We ran directly in among the breakers. She struck once, heavily, bows on, and then swung broadside onto the rocks. The first mate shouted for the crew to come on deck. Captain Soule seized an axe and began cutting away the masts in a desperate attempt to lighten the ship. Then came a tremendous wave. It struck with such force that the vessel split in two. Planks shattered. Spars snapped. The crew was thrown into the churning surf. In the chaos, Wilson and Soule clung to wreckage. Wilson reportedly said, "Captain, you were a little nearer land than you thought." Soule replied with quiet resignation, "Yes, but it was not my fault. I did the best I could." Captain Cornelius Soule did not survive. Neither did 10 of his crew. 11 lives were lost. The survivors, drenched and numbed by cold, crawled up a bluff and found their way to a nearby whaling station at Pigeon Point. Local residents rendered assistance, providing dry clothing, food, drink, and warm beds. In the fisherman's chapel at Pescadero, the survivors gathered in prayer. Tearfully, they mourned officers and shipmates so suddenly torn away from the companionship of the living and whelmed in the cold abyss of the pitiless sea. The combined losses of Coya in 1866 and Hellespont in 1868 totaled 37 lives. This time, public outrage intensified. The tragedies were no longer isolated accidents. They formed a pattern. The same reef, the same fog, the same fatal miscalculation. By the end of 1868, the pattern was unmistakable. In just 2 years, 37 people had died in 2 tragedies. The sea had spoken many times. Now the public began to respond. Among the most forceful voices was Schofield, editor of the San Mateo County Gazette. He did not write cautiously. He wrote with urgency. In the aftermath of the Hellespont wreck, Schofield declared that the recent terrible disaster constitutes another appeal to the government at Washington for the establishment of a lighthouse at Pigeon Point. He argued that Pigeon Point was the most extensive promontory south of the Golden Gate and uniquely suited for a lighthouse. More importantly, he insisted that no other place on the Pacific coast had proved so fatal to navigators. Schofield understood something crucial. This was no longer a matter of isolated accidents. It was a systemic failure. The combination of treacherous currents, steel-gray fog, and miscalculated dead reckoning created predictable hazard. And predictable hazards demanded permanent solutions. But Schofield went further. He warned that a light alone would not be enough. In dense coastal fog, when visibility dropped to yards rather than miles, even the brightest beacon could be swallowed whole. He called for an audible fog signal, a bell or a whistle of sufficient volume to penetrate the mist. A fog bell or whistle, he argued, would unquestionably be found useful. Such a signal, he believed, might have saved the Hellespont and other vessels lost in the vicinity. His editorials were not whispers. They were rallying cries. He urged citizens, ship owners, navigators, and commercial interests to press their delegates in Congress. He insisted that elected officials must not be permitted to forget the influence of their constituents. Schofield was not alone in his frustration. For nearly a decade, the U.S. Lighthouse Service Board had been criticized across the country for what many saw as an inadequate system of coastal lights. shipping interests complained. Chambers of commerce protested. Mariners demanded better protection. The board, hampered by internal politics and slow appropriations, struggled to keep pace with expanding maritime commerce. But the tragedies at Pigeon Point created momentum that could not easily be ignored. At the end of 1868, Congress appropriated $90,000 for the establishment of a lighthouse and fog signal at Pigeon Point. $90,000, an enormous investment at the time, represented more than construction funds. It represented acknowledgement. It meant that Washington had finally recognized what the wreckage along that coast had been saying for 15 years. The site was secured 2 years later. Planning and construction moved forward. Yet even before the tower itself was ready, the urgency of the situation demanded interim protection. On September 10, 1871, the fog signal at Pigeon Point went into operation. Before there was a completed lighthouse beam sweeping the sea, there was sound. An audible warning cutting through the coastal mist. For mariners approaching the central California shoreline, that signal meant something profoundly new. The government was finally listening. But the defining moment came the following year. In November 1872, District Lighthouse Inspector Captain Charles J. McDougall formally examined the Pigeon Point Light Station and determined it was ready for operation. The district lampist, Thomas J. Winship, prepared the station's massive oil lamp 8 feet tall and instructed the keepers in its use. Then, on Friday, November 15, 1872, at sunset, the lamp was lit. The clockwork mechanism engaged, rotating the lens. For the first time in history, a fixed point of light stood guard over the reef that had destroyed so many ships. The technology itself reflected the best innovation of the era. At the heart of the tower was a Fresnel lens, designed according to the revolutionary optical principles developed by French physicist Augustin Fresnel. Rather than relying on inefficient metal reflectors, the Fresnel system used concentric rings of glass prisms arranged in a stair-step configuration. This design bent and focused the available light outward with remarkable efficiency, capturing nearly 80% of the lamp's output. At Pigeon Point, the original lamp and lens combination produced approximately 70,000 candle power. In the 1870s, that was an extraordinary intensity, visible for miles under clear conditions and capable of piercing moderate haze. At the heart of Pigeon Point's lantern room was the Fresnel lens, one of the most important innovations in lighthouse history. It was named for Augustin Fresnel, a French physicist born in 1788, who in 1822 was commissioned by France to improve lighthouse illumination. Prior to Fresnel's work, lighthouses relied largely on silvered metal parabolic reflectors positioned behind lamps. These systems directed some light seaward, but much of it was lost. A flame radiates in all directions. Capturing and concentrating that light efficiently was the challenge. Fresnel approached the problem not by attempting to create a brighter flame, but by designing a more efficient optical system. Rather than casting one enormous solid lens, which would have been impractical due to weight and manufacturing limits, he developed a system of concentric glass prisms arranged in a stepped configuration. These prisms bent, folded, and focused light outward in a concentrated beam. The result was extraordinary. A Fresnel lens could utilize roughly 80% of the light produced by the lamp, far more efficient than earlier reflector systems. At Pigeon Point, the original lamp and lens combination generated approximately 70,000 candle power. For the early 1870s, that was a remarkable intensity. It meant visibility over significant distances under clear conditions. It meant that a captain approaching from Australia, counting the seconds between flashes, could orient himself with confidence. Equally important was the modular nature of the Fresnel lens. It could be disassembled, shipped in sections, and reassembled at remote stations. Its configuration allowed for virtually limitless light characteristics, patterns of flashes and eclipses that uniquely identified each lighthouse. Pigeon Point's characteristic was set at one flash every 10 seconds. That rhythm distinguished it from other coastal lights. In an era when southeast Farallon Island flashed once per minute and Point Reyes flashed once every 5 seconds, Pigeon Point's 10-second interval became its signature. But light requires fuel. In California's earliest lighthouse years, sperm whale oil had been the primary fuel source. It burned relatively cleanly and brightly. However, by the mid-1800s, sperm whale populations had declined sharply, while industrial demand for whale oil increased. Prices rose steadily. The lighthouse service faced a practical decision. Professor Joseph Henry, a member of the Lighthouse Board and secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, conducted experiments demonstrating that lard oil, rendered from animal fat, burned effectively in lighthouse lamps at roughly half the cost of sperm oil. The decision to convert from whale oil to lard oil was not sentimental. It was economic. It reflected a broader reality of lighthouse administration. Even as these towers stood as symbols of safety and sacrifice, they were also subject to budgets and efficiency calculations. By the late 1860s, California's lighthouses, including Pigeon Point, had transitioned to lard oil as their primary fuel. Thus, when the 8-foot-tall lamp at Pigeon Point was lit on November 15, 1872, and when it continued to burn through the years that followed, including the sorrow of 1878, it did so not by romance alone, but by science, engineering, and fiscal pragmatism. The tower on that rugged headland was not just a warning. It was the embodiment of innovation, of adaptability, and of endurance through the storms. By 1878, the Pigeon Point Lighthouse had been in operation for nearly 6 years. Since November 15, 1872, its beam had swept the Pacific every 10 seconds, a steady pulse of warning along a coast that had once devoured ships in silence. The tower stood firm. The fog signal had already been sounding since September 10, 1871. Mariners offshore now had both light and sound to guide them. But tragedy struck not a passing vessel, but the family entrusted with keeping the light alive. The head keeper at the time, John Monroe, lived at the station with his family as lighthouse keepers often did. Their lives were intertwined with the tower. The light did not extinguish at dawn and return at dusk by itself. It required constant maintenance, trimming of wicks, cleaning of lenses, monitoring of clockwork, and the daily routines that kept a coastal station functional in isolation. The Monroe family lived atop cliffs that dropped steeply into the Pacific below. The same bluffs that offered commanding views of the ocean were unforgiving. Wind swept across them with force. Fog reduced visibility. The terrain was rugged and uneven. One day in 1878, John Monroe's 5-year-old son fell from those cliffs. The fall proved fatal. There was no storm at sea, no splintering timbers, no desperate cries from a sinking deck. The tragedy came not from the ocean, but from the very ground beneath the lighthouse. The rocks that had once torn open the hulls of ships now claimed a life from the family charged with preventing further loss. For the Monroes, the beam that rotated every 10 seconds must have taken on a different meaning after that day. The light they kept for others could not shield their own child. This event left a quiet but enduring scar in the history of Pigeon Point. It reminds us that lighthouse keeping was not merely a job, it was a life lived on the edge, literally and figuratively. Isolation, exposure to harsh weather, mechanical responsibility, and proximity to danger were constant companions. By 1929, Pigeon Point Lighthouse had been standing for 57 years. Since November 15, 1872, its beam had swept the Pacific every 10 seconds. The fog signal, first activated on September 10, 1871, had long since become part of the coastline's rhythm. Generations of keepers had climbed the tower, trimmed wicks, polished glass, and kept the clockwork turning. The reef that had destroyed the Coya and the Hellespont still lay hidden beneath the swells, but the light above it had changed the pattern of disaster. Ships now approached the San Mateo County coast with guidance, visible flashes and audible warnings cutting through darkness and mist. And yet, on a fog-bound night in 1929, tragedy returned with a force that proved a terrible truth. Light reduces danger, but it does not eliminate it. The passenger steamer San Juan was underway along the California coast when she encountered heavy fog. The Pacific that night was blanketed in thick mist, the kind that erases horizons and swallows distances. Visibility dropped to a fraction of what navigators prefer. Sound carried strangely. Shapes appeared without warning. Somewhere approximately 12 miles off the San Mateo County coastline, in that gray blindness, the San Juan crossed paths with the standard oil tanker S.C.T. Dodd. What happened next unfolded with brutal speed. The heavy stern of the tanker struck the San Juan with catastrophic force. Survivors later reported that the passenger vessel was nearly sheared in half by the impact. There were indications that a massive hole had been torn into her side. Water poured in immediately. Below deck, passengers were in their staterooms. Crew members were in their bunks. Many had no warning that their vessel had been mortally wounded. As the flooding reached the engine room, there was a hiss of steam. Then came an explosion. The boilers detonated, shattering the structure from stem to stern. According to testimony gathered afterward, the entire sequence from collision to sinking took less than 5 minutes. Some accounts described it not as a matter of minutes at all, but of seconds. 5 minutes. In that time, there was no orderly evacuation, no full deployment of lifeboats, no gradual listing that might have allowed passengers to assemble on deck. The violence of the collision and the speed of the flooding left little opportunity for rescue. 77 people lost their lives. 77. Most were passengers. Many were women and children. For the residents along the coast, and for those stationed at Pigeon Point Lighthouse, the horror was not distant or abstract. The cries of survivors carried across the water in the fog. Voices called out in the darkness, pleas for help, for light, for something solid in a world that had just dissolved beneath their feet. The lighthouse keepers did what they could. They responded in urgency and desperation. But the sinking had been too swift, the distance too great, the sea too cold. Rescue vessels were dispatched. The following day, law enforcement officers patrolled the shoreline. Coast Guard cutters searched in vain for additional survivors or bodies. Hundreds of residents gathered along the coast, watching the water with a mixture of hope and dread. As the facts emerged, so did the familiar pattern of confusion and blame. There was discussion of fog density, of navigation decisions, of visibility of lights, of course changes. Responsibility was argued. Investigations followed. But for the families of the 77 who perished, the technical conclusions offered little comfort. This disaster was not like the earlier wrecks of the 1860s. The Coya and the Hellespont had been destroyed on the reef itself, undone by dead reckoning and hidden stone. The San Juan tragedy was different. It was a collision at sea, an encounter between two vessels, navigating the same obscured waters, and yet it occurred within sight of a lighthouse, built precisely because that stretch of coast had proven so fatal. That is what makes 1929 the darkest chapter in the history of Pigeon Point. By then, the tower had long been established. Its Fresnel lens still rotated with disciplined precision. Its characteristic flash, one burst of light every 10 seconds, remained unchanged. Mariners approaching from offshore could count the rhythm and know their position. But position alone does not prevent collision. A lighthouse can warn of reefs. It can announce land. It can guide a vessel safely around a headland. But it cannot control the course of two ships converging in fog. It cannot slow a tanker's momentum. It cannot grant extra minutes when steel meets steel. On that night in 1929, the Pacific demonstrated that even in the presence of light, it retains its power. For the keepers at Pigeon Point, the event must have echoed the old tragedies that had justified the tower's existence. Once again, the coastline was associated with cries in the mist. Once again, lives were lost within reach of safety. And once again, the light continued to flash every 10 seconds, steady, unchanging, indifferent to human grief yet born from it. The sinking of the San Juan remains one of the worst maritime disasters ever to occur off the San Mateo County coastline. It stands not as a failure of the lighthouse, but as a sobering reminder of its limits. Technology can mitigate risk, it can reduce uncertainty, it can transform a lethal reef into a charted hazard. But it cannot erase the sea's unpredictability. In 1853, there had been no light. In 1866 and 1868, there had been no tower. By 1929, there was both light and sound. And still, 77 people vanished beneath the surface in less than 5 minutes. That is the hard truth embedded in the history of Pigeon Point. 1934, more than 6 decades had passed since Pigeon Point Lighthouse was first lit on November 15th, 1872. In 1934, Pigeon Point was converted from oil to electricity. This was not a symbolic update. It was a profound operational shift. For over 60 years, maintaining the light required constant manual labor. Oil had to be stored, measured, transported up narrow stairs, and carefully managed. Flames had to be watched. Mechanisms had to be wound. Even a brief lapse could mean darkness. Electric power reduced that burden dramatically. The beam became more stable, more consistent, stronger in reliability. No longer dependent on combustion, the lighthouse could operate with far less daily physical strain placed upon the keeper. For the men assigned to Pigeon Point, electrification meant fewer sleepless nights spent guarding against flame failure. It meant less soot, less risk of mechanical interruption, less vulnerability to human fatigue. Technology did not remove responsibility, but it modernized it. This transition in 1934 represented a broader evolution in maritime safety along the American coastline. The light that had once relied on lard oil, adopted in the late 1860s for economic reasons after sperm whale oil became too expensive, had already passed through stages of refinement. Now electricity marked another leap forward. In 1980, Pigeon Point Lighthouse was officially declared a California State Historic Landmark. This designation was not simply architectural recognition. It was acknowledgement that the tower represented more than masonry and glass. It embodied nearly a century of maritime struggle, innovation, and sacrifice. In May 2005, ownership of the lighthouse was transferred from the United States Coast Guard to California State Parks. The structure remained an active aid to navigation, but it also became a protected historical site, preserved not only for mariners, but for the public. Today, Pigeon Point still functions, and remarkably, it still flashes once every 10 seconds, exactly as it did in 1872. More than 150 years later, the characteristic remains unchanged. One flash, 10 seconds, again and again. Automation has replaced the long hours of manual tending. Modern systems ensure reliability that 19th century keepers could only dream of. But the visible pattern is identical to the one first observed at sunset on November 15th, 1872. Pigeon Point was not built out of ambition. It was built out of loss. It stands because ships broke apart in the fog, because captains misjudged distance, because mothers held children as waves closed over them, because 77 souls vanished in less than 5 minutes in 1929. This tower is more than brick and glass. It is a response to grief. Every 10 seconds, the light flashes. Not for spectacle, not for history books, but for memory. It honors the crews of the Carrier Pigeon, the Coya, the Hellespont, and the San Juan. It honors the fathers who did their best, the children who never came home, the voices once heard in the mist. The ocean does not remember, but this light does. Finally, thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this history moved you, please consider liking and sharing so more people can remember what happened here. And if you have your own story about a lighthouse, something you've seen, felt, or experienced, I'd truly love to read it. Leave a comment and join the conversation. Subscribe to follow future episodes, and I'll see you in the next chapter of the Lighthouse Tragedy series.